Is this is my name up on screen?
It is, yep.
David, or have you?
Yes, it is, mate. Everything's just set to go and I'm recording.
Place.
Okay.
The original name of Cockermouth was Cockermouth, and it's a market town in Cumbria, and it was named because it was built on the at the junction really of the River Cocker, which means crooked. If you actually have a look, follow that river, you can see why it got its name. And it actually, the place got its name from the word Cookra, which is a Celtic word meaning crooked. This is the market town. Virtually the town has been rebuilt since about 2005 when the rivers flooded and much of the town was damaged. Now most of the town is considered worthy of preservation, and they've done really a marvellous job. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of this is the actual marketplace, but it's only one side of it. But there's some lovely buildings off to the right. The place has been, people have been living in Cockermouth for about 4,000 years, they reckon. And this is the site of a Roman fort where Roman soldiers used to stay for a short while before they went on to Hadrian's Wall, which was the barrier between what was then England, Britain and Scotland. There was also during the Norman time, because we were still having fights with Scotland. There was a castle built called the Cockermouth Castle. Unfortunately, Robert the Bruce actually demolished it, but it really is a beautiful place. It's as I say, in the Lake District in northwestern England. Very, very close to Lake Windermere. Anyway, just to go back a little, my father was in the Navy. He joined the training ship, the Ganges, the HMS Ganges, and that was actually the training ship. They call it I think it was a second class ship, and it meant that it actually had 2 decks. Not that it was that is no reflection on the comfort or discomfort of the place. It was just because of the way the cannons were set, as you can see, rows up on the hull. When Dad finished his training, he joined the HMS Shropshire, which was the cruiser that was given to Australia after the sinking of HMS Sydney. And in fact, that's how Dad that was his actual first visit to Australia, and apparently he'd made up his mind at that time if he ever got the chance he would come back. The next ship that after the ship was handed over to the Australians, he joined the Ajax, another cruiser, and the Ajax was the ship that witnessed the sinking of the Graf's Bay at the Battle of the River Plate. My father actually took photographs of it, which were censored until after the war. You had to hand everything over, including the negatives, but sometimes the public service can be very efficient, and he actually got them back after the war. His next ship, when the Ajax went back, left the Battle of the River Plate, as I understand it, she went back to England for a refit, and my father actually was assigned to Chatham, and he then joined as a crew member on the Seraphis, the submarine that is is pictured down here. Now, all the from what I can work out, the S-class submarine for you, David, the S-class submarines were replaced the A-class. As far as I can work out, most of them were built at Chatham. Now, Dad was with the Serapis, I believe, until about 1948. He was, as I've mentioned before, he was regular Navy. He wasn't called up for the war. But the Serapis claim to fame was that that was the submarine that played in the part of, you know, the story of the man that never was. That was the body that they dumped overboard with detail of the landings in Normandy. And Dad was actually serving on that submarine at the time. Now, you wouldn't think that this thing here was romantic, but it was this is an anti-aircraft gun that sits alongside HMS Ocelot, which now at Chatham, the Chatham dockyard, which is now just a gigantic 400-acre maritime museum. But these guns, my mother used to teach people how to fire them. She was the gunnery and training, and it was at Chatham that Mum and Dad met. As I said, not the most romantic of places and not the most romantic pieces of equipment, but Mum and Dad had an interest in common, which was guns, big guns. After we left the northeast of England, we actually moved. Sorry, at northwestland. We moved to the northeast, and as you can see, I've got I stuck with another name which isn't too good, called Cox Lodge. A really funny place. Cobbled streets. These are mining cottages, and my memories of my grandmother is wearing a pinny like that. I don't think she was ever out of it. I look at that, and of course the memories of my memories about the age of 4 or 5 start coming back. When Dad left the Navy, he actually went to the Rising Sun Colliery, which is here. He was whilst he was in the Navy, as I mentioned, he was into into guns. He was a gunnery officer, but he but also was an expert in explosives, demolition, and he got a job as a shot firer at first the Rising Sun Colliery, where his father and I believe his grandfather worked before that, and then Dad went on from there to a mine nearby called Hazelwood Colliery. This is some of the back streets of Cox Lodge, and as you can see, the buildings are of stone. Unfortunately, all of these places have gone, which is a crying shame, because whilst they're not beautiful pieces of architecture in my view, you know, they do represent a lifestyle which is now on, because this place, Hazelwood, the Rising Sun, and Hazelwood Colliery are now parks. The mines have gone, and virtually there's just nothing left. And much of Cox Lodge has been demolished as well. It's not always dim and like those other pictures would suggest. It's near about 2 miles away from a place called Gosforth. This is Gosforth High Street. I've got some earlier pictures, but they don't really represent this street as it is now, because much of this street again was demolished to put highways through. My grandparents would have been lived in streets off to the right. Mum's family, Mum was born in London, but her father actually was born in Northumberland as well, and Mum's ancestors, so to speak, lived in Durham City as well, and this is what Durham is renowned for, which they say is the best remaining Norman cathedral in the world. family were called Beagle. Originally they came from Belgium. There were some migrants from, I think they were cloth workers or something like that. They actually moved into, oh, I've got a sign here saying the webcam closed by the organizer.
It's okay, mate. No, it's okay. Just keep going. I've turned your camera off because we're getting breakdown in the picture, but it's okay now.
Okay. All right. Where did I get up to? Did you hear the bit about my parents, my mother?
No.
Right. Well, my mother's family, my mother was born in London, but her father's family came from Durham, where we ultimately moved to. They were a Belgian family that moved there probably in about the 15th century, from what we can work out. They would have come over as cloth workers or milliners or whatever, I'm not sure, but they actually wound up being mine owners, so it was rather interesting. My mother's family owned mines and my father's family worked in them. So there were enormous class differences, as you can well imagine. Durham is really the place that I call home. That's the interior of Durham Cathedral. How this survived the Reformation in England, I have absolutely no idea. This window at the end is called the Rose Window, and it's the most beautiful thing you could ever see. Nothing much to look at from the outside, but from the inside looking out, it's absolutely fantastic. Underneath this floor are the crypts. They've also got much of the cathedral's treasury down there, apart from the tombs of, and there's also the tombs of some famous people. The most famous person of all is St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert is really the reason for the town's being. Durham comes from the Old English word dun, D-U-N, meaning hill, and Old Norse, H-O-L-M-E, which transfers to island. So the actual name of Durham originally was Dun Island. Some people attribute the city's name to the Dun cow and the milkmaid, who in legend guided the monks of Lindisfarne, who were carrying the body of St. Cuthbert. They were actually waiting for divine inspiration as to where to bury him, and they actually buried him at the present site of the cathedral in 995 AD. Prior to that, St. Cuthbert's body was stored, if you like, can't think of another word for it, in a place called Chesterley Street, which is just a little north of where Durham is now. Adjoining the cathedral is a beautiful castle, and it was actually the home of the bishops of Durham. It's very, very heavily fortified, as a lot of the towns in the north of England were, against the Scots. The town of Durham was invaded many, many times, as was Newcastle before it, and at one time it was, it really was part of Scotland. The area is probably where the word Sassenach comes from, where Sassenach, the original meaning of that was Saxon, and the area that I'm talking about was actually settled by Norsemen, who were in fact Saxons. The place has been occupied, or Durham has been occupied, since about 2000 BC. You can't dig up any street in Durham without finding remains, and in fact before I get on to that, this is Durham City Marketplace. If I recall correctly, that's the old the old Durham City Hall or council chambers, I'm not sure. Here are the undercover markets. my mother used to spend hours and hours there wandering around the stalls. The original marketplace was all cobblestone. It was cobblestone when I was living there, and there are streets running off to the left and to the right, and a couple of streets behind the cameraman on this. And the only way, and since there were blind streets, the only way they could control the traffic was through a structure they had in the centre of the marketplace, and that a policeman in there controlled the traffic lights by using TV cameras down those streets. And I believe it was the first example in the world. If you actually have a look up there, that's the flag for Durham, which is, if I remember right, it's a red. Well, it's red, white, and blue, but it's a red cross, if I recall. And that's my first place of work. That's the Shire Hall, or what, and were the council chambers up until the 1960s. When I was there, they built a new government building north of the city, just north of the city, and we actually moved into that. This is now controlled by the university, the Durham University, and much of the building was used for student accommodation. It really is a glorious building. However, just up that street that I'm pointing out with the arrow, it goes round the corner, you have Durham Prison, which is one of the, certainly not the most attractive building in the world, and has held some of the worst criminals you can imagine in there, including a number of serial killers. The reason I mention it at all is the fact that my father worked there for a number of years. He was a prison officer there, and then he moved down to London just before I left to come to Australia. At that point, the pictures stop. I arrived in, I worked for Durham County Council from leaving school in 1961. I joined Durham County Council and I left there midway through 1963. Lived in London with my parents for a few months, and then migrated to Australia. I was one of the unfortunates that were sponsored by the Big Brother movement, which was part of the Dr. Bernardo's homes. The system was set up for orphans, and when they ran out of orphans, they accepted people like me who were underage and weren't able to leave the country unless they had a sponsor. So I wasn't a £10 POM, I was free. And I think that's about the only advantage that I had. Originally, when I lived here, when I first moved here, I lived at Ashfield, and I worked for R.B. Davies, the people who make locks, or did in those days. Some of you may remember Schlag locks, which were very, very good and very secure locks at the time. They made hinges and all sorts of building hardware. I actually worked for a subsidiary called Consolidated High Lift Hoists, and they used to build overhead cranes, and they did steel work. In actual fact, I did some of the original work for calculating the cost of construction of the Sydney Opera House. Now, can't blame me for what it cost, because we decided in the end it was all too hard and gave up on the idea. Because we just couldn't work out how long it was going to take to build that structure, and of course the manpower requirements were critical. About that time I became interested in scuba diving, like my father, and I was persuaded to join McSimmons when they were down in George Street in Sydney, and I worked for them for about 12 or 18 months. Then the Australian Army decided to call me up. I've got to say that I was a little teed off at that, because I'd only just arrived in the country, and they wanted me to go over to well, in fact they were hiring for Vietnam. You'll recall that very well, Ross, no doubt. I was found not to be suitable. I didn't pass the medical tests. They found that I had something called diverticulosis, which is a problem with a large bowel, and I thought that was actually the end of it. But then they called me back, and I had to spend an hour with a psychiatrist. I don't know what the idea of that was. Now, maybe I do know now that that I'm bipolar, but I didn't know that at the time, and they didn't tell me. They just sent me a letter saying you are permanently excused. So they didn't want me. In 1966, I joined the travel industry. I joined a company called Adelaide Steamship Company, and I managed their crew movements department for some little time, moving crews virtually all over the world. Adelaide Steamship Company and P&O, the shipping line, had a joint venture which ultimately led to containerization in Australia, and I actually worked for P&O for a couple of years. And actually, that's how I met my wife. I was actually working on the crew. I was a member of the crew on the Himalaya. We called the Himalaya the Queer Rooster for obvious reasons, but it's a ship that I remember very fondly because that's actually where I met my wife, and we married in 1971. It was a great job, but it didn't pay very much, and I left there, and Cheryl had an old boyfriend that used to work for Associated Securities, which was a finance company. Her descriptions and Graham's description of that industry I found very appealing, and that way I actually started a 30-year career. 2 years with GMAC, that's part of General Motors, 5 years with AGC. I worked for 8 years as a finance broker, and that was the time that I decided that I had enough independence that I could do what I wanted to do for an awful long time, and that was to pursue a university education, which I hadn't had the opportunity to do when I was young. My parents couldn't afford it, and Durham University would have to be one of the most exclusive universities in the world, so there wasn't much chance of me going there. So I studied, I did most of my bachelor's degree at the University of Technology in Sydney, finished it off at Charles Sturt University, had a couple of years break, and then finished a master's degree when I was, about 55, I think. I finished up at Oryx Australia as marketing director. I'd actually worked my way through from being sales manager for New South Wales, and then expanded the business throughout Australia and then overseas. When I left, and it's not due to me, but when we started, we had net assets of about 15 million. When I actually finished, when I left there in 2000, we had 2 billion. So the business expanded very rapidly over those years. When I finished my master's degree, I actually decided I would do some part-time academic work, and from 1996 to 2005 I worked first at Charles Sturt University, then did some work with one of their alliance partners, the International Marketing Institute, and then finally with the University of Wollongong. And in 2005 I joined the University of Wollongong full-time. I specialize in retail marketing and management, and also international management and marketing. I've worked, the company I worked for was Japanese multinational, and I got moved around quite a lot, helping with business development, not only for Australia, but also for the head office in Tokyo. As far as my Rotary career is concerned, I joined in 2001, and of course I got caught up straight away, as like we all do. I did 2 years as treasurer, and then I did 2 back-to-back terms as president. I'm particularly proud of the fact that our centennial project was the adult daycare centre in Mossvale. That was a $2 million facility, which was funded through, well, obviously generosity of the community and some Rotary clubs in the area. But we got and of course the council. So it's if we try to raise the money for this, running barbecues, I think it would have taken several lifetimes. But one of the things that I did find out in that process is how much money is available if you know where to look. I had some particularly good members of that in my team. After I left as president, I became secretary of the club. I did that for a couple of years, and I was also assistant governor for the Highlands region for a couple of years. And I was AG when the idea of doing cricket was first floated. So it's something my information on that is a little bit old, but I certainly remember it when it started. The couple of years ago, it really got all too much. I think I've been too busy in Rotary, and I'd actually burnt myself out. And with working full time again, because for a lot of the time I've been that I was in Rotary, I've been working part time, and I hadn't been able to. I just really wasn't able to cope with everything, and I actually resigned from the Rotary Club of Mossvale. But shortly after that, I learned about Brindabella starting up, and I was very, very happy to be able to transfer my membership and retain some flexibility. So I'm really looking forward to a whole new Rotary career with a new club. That's it. Are there any questions?
Yeah, the first question I'd ask is, your father, did he ever make it to Australia again?
Yes, he did. I came out in 1964. Mum and Dad and the remainder of my family came out in 1967. Dad tried to come to Australia after the war, but he was his lungs were in pretty bad shape. I think he'd spent some time in a colliery before, but the mines here are very, very dry, and they were worried about silicosis, so he wasn't able to make it. In the end, he actually transferred from the British Civil Service, which was where he was in the prison service at that time, and he worked for a couple of years at Long Bay Jail as a prison officer there. So that's actually how he made it in the end, but it was 1967 before he was able to get out.
Okay. Thank you. You're all unmuted, guys, so you can ask questions.
It's Ross. Geoff, your dad must have been absolutely excited and right in the thick of battle at being on board Ajax when the Grass Bay went down, because if I'm not mistaken, it was knocked about a bit, Ajax.
Yeah. It took some fire, I believe, and I think that was probably after the. I sort of skipped out a bit when they finished at the battle at the River Plate. They actually headed towards the Falkland Islands, and they were there for a little while. They probably did repairs before they actually went home.
Right.
But he says to me that he had a good war. If there is
well, that was a good war. That was a big kill.
Geoff, I don't think you...
Go ahead, Beck. Sorry.
Geoff, I don't think you mentioned working on your PhD.
Oh, that's still very much work in progress.
Well,
yeah, I virtually finished the
it's probably a big part of it.
Yeah, I've actually finished my course, all but one subject from my coursework. As I mentioned earlier, I am bipolar, so I have to pace myself a bit. But the other thing that I haven't mentioned, of course, is that my wife has got leukemia, and she's been suffering from that for about 5 or 6 years. About the time that I joined the University of Wollongong full time. Anyway, everything went down the drain virtually. We had to walk away from a business that we'd actually bought for Cheryl. We just virtually had to close the door, and we lost an awful lot of money doing that. And I think perhaps the stress got to me, I'm not sure, because I came down with shingles last year, and I had to put my my doctorate on hold, and I'm hoping to get back to it later this year. I'm actually now feeling very well, so I'm ready to take it up again. I'm interested in using commercial marketing techniques to achieve social outcomes. The area that I'm looking at is vandalism and graffiti, two of probably the hardest areas to overcome, and I'm hoping that social marketing will provide some answers to that problem. It costs Australia $2 billion a year, and that's not the human life cost, that's the actual physical cost. There was a young guy killed on the Sydney trains only a few months ago.
That's right.
Apparently he was mad about graffiti, and what he didn't know was that the trains after dark speed up and they're absolutely silent. Anyway, one snuck up on him and ran over it.
Goodness.
He won't make that mistake again, will he?
Thanks for your sympathy, Ross.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but, well, I've got to admit, I got to say that, you know, his mother was saying, oh, what a lovely boy he was, and he was passionate about graffiti. Well, I'm sorry, that's just one of the risks.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't feel sorry for him, I feel sorry for his mother.
Yeah.
And the train driver.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing that people don't take into account. The effect on train drivers is absolutely dreadful. Many of them are never able to work again, and many suffer mental health problems afterwards.
Geoff, it's Bruce.
Yes?
I was very interested in your comments about fundraising, and particularly seeking funding for your dream cricket. I wonder if we could speak separately, perhaps if I gave you a call sometime in the next couple of days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Give us some of your advice. We've actually got a working committee looking at fundraising at the moment.
Yeah, there is a database of all of the charities and foundations and whatnot in Australia. That's worthwhile going through.
Yes, I think
it's only a question.
We are on that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the clues has always been, though, with going for these, is demonstrating that the project that they are working on is not only worthwhile, of course, but it is sustainable as well.
Yes. Yep. No, can I give you a call separately on that?
Yeah, absolutely.